When the sledgehammer finally broke through the plaster, the air that rushed out wasn't just stale. It smelled like a century of buried secrets, like Kenneth Whitmore had sealed something down there that was never meant to breathe again. Melissa Thompson stood in the ruined library with dust coating her hair and hands blistered raw, staring into the jagged hole she'd just torn through a wall that had stood untouched since 1890. The beam from her flashlight cut through the white cloud and caught something that made her breath stop, completely heavy, steel, industrial, and cold, where there should have been nothing but wood and brick. Nicole's voice came from behind, small but steady, in the way 9-year-olds sound when they're trying not to be scared. "Mom, are you absolutely sure about this?" Melissa didn't turn around. She couldn't, because beyond that steel door barely visible through the gap, a spiral staircase descended into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light whole. Kenneth's journal entry burned in her memory, the frantic handwriting that looked like it had been written by someone running out of time. The hollow wall will guard what they cannot find. 2 weeks ago, she'd been a broke high school teacher dodging debt collectors in a Chicago apartment with broken air conditioning. Now she was standing in a condemned Victorian mansion, about to discover whether her dead uncle had been a paranoid lunatic or the only sane man in a world gone corrupt. The sledgehammer slipped from her grip and hit the floor with a sound like thunder. Ugh. 2 weeks earlier, Melissa had been grading papers at her kitchen table while her phone buzzed with the third debt collector call of the day. The clock read 11:47 p.m. and Nicole was asleep on the couch because the bedroom was too hot to breathe in the air conditioner, having died in July with no money to replace it. Stacks of essays about the French Revolution covered every surface, red pen marks, bleeding across teenage attempts to understand why people revolt when the system stops working. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was teaching kids about uprising while her own life collapsed one unpaid bill at a time. The envelope arrived that night, thick and cream-colored, with a return address that made her stomach drop. Wright and Associates Law Firm, Manhattan. She'd stared at it for 10 minutes before opening, convinced it was another lawsuit, another piece of her mother's medical debt coming home to roost 2 years after the funeral. Instead, the letter inside requested her presence for a video conference regarding the estate of Kenneth Whitmore, deceased. Melissa had barely remembered the name. Her mother had mentioned Uncle Kenneth exactly 3 times in 34 years, always in the same tone people use when discussing family members who'd embarrassed everyone by going spectacularly insane. The outcast, the one who'd lost a shipping fortune to paranoid delusions and bad investments in the 1980s, who died alone in some upstate motel room with nothing but conspiracy theories and unpaid bills. The Zoom call with Brenda Wright happened 3 days later. The lawyer appeared on screen with sharp eyes and a sympathetic expression that looked professionally maintained, the kind of face you practiced when delivering bad news to desperate people. She delivered the basics efficiently. Kenneth Whitmore had passed away at 91 in a care facility near Albany. No other living relatives. Melissa was the sole heir. The estate consisted of one property, Whitmore Manor in the Hudson Valley, a Victorian structure built in 1892 by Melissa's great-great-grandfather during the Gilded Age, when the Whitmore name had meant something in shipping circles. Melissa's heart had done a stupid little jump at the word manor, the kind of hope that poverty teaches you to kill immediately before it gets you hurt. Brenda's next words had done the killing for her. The property has been condemned by the county. There are $82,000 in back taxes owed. You have 30 days to clear any personal effects before the state seizes the land and demolishes the structure. The hope died, but something else stirred in its place. Melissa's historian brain, the part that had gotten her through a PhD program on a full scholarship before life had intervened, started calculating. Even condemned properties had salvage value. Antiques books, fixtures, anything she could sell before the bulldozers came. A few $1,000s might not erase her debts, but it could buy breathing room, could keep Nicole fed through winter, could maybe possibly be the difference between survival and eviction. She'd packed the Honda Civic that weekend with sleeping bags and peanut butter sandwiches and Nicole's stuffed rabbit, the one with the missing eye that had survived 5 years of single motherhood and a divorce that had cost Melissa everything but her daughter. Nicole had been excited in the way kids get about adventures they don't understand, asking questions the whole 4-hour drive from Chicago. Why didn't anyone like Great-Uncle Kenneth? And is the mansion really haunted? And can we keep it if it's nice? Melissa had tried explaining that sometimes people called you crazy when you saw things others didn't want to see, that fear made people cruel, that the world wasn't always fair to those who told uncomfortable truths. Nicole had gone quiet for a while, watching Illinois farmland blur past the window, then asked with that devastating child logic, like you saw Dad was bad before everyone else did. The tears had come, then hot and unexpected. Melissa had pulled over at a rest stop and held her daughter for 5 minutes, both of them crying in a parking lot 2 states from anything that felt like home. The manor rose from the woods like something that had died but refused to lie down. The dirt road leading to it was choked with oak trees that twisted overhead in a canopy so dense the afternoon sun barely penetrated, and when the house finally came into view, Nicole's assessment had been immediate and accurate. It looks haunted, but like a sad haunted. Melissa's historian instincts cataloged details automatically. 3-story, Victorian Gothic, probably 12,000 square feet slate roof with tiles missing like broken teeth. Windows boarded over with plywood that had weathered gray ivy, strangling the brickwork in thick ropes that looked more parasitic than decorative. The front porch sagged in the middle, and the paint had peeled away in strips, exposing wood gone soft with rot. Everything about it screamed abandonment, but underneath the decay she could see the bones of something that had once been magnificent. They'd cut the padlock on the front door with bolt cutters from a hardware store and pushed their way inside. The air hit them like a physical thing, thick and choking with dust and mildew, and the particular smell of spaces that haven't been disturbed in decades. Furniture hulked under yellowing sheets, ghost shapes in the gloom. Melissa's flashlight beam cut through the murk and illuminated a grand foyer with a staircase that curved upward into darkness, the banister carved with details too intricate to have survived in modern construction. Nicole found the first photograph in the parlor, a framed picture half buried under decades of grime. She'd wiped it clean with her sleeve and held it up Kenneth Whitmore as a young man, maybe 40, wearing a suit, and looking directly at the camera with eyes that didn't seem crazy at all. Stern, yes. Guarded, absolutely. But not insane. Melissa had started her inventory, then, moving room by room with a notebook and pen, cataloging anything that might have value. Furniture mostly ruined by moisture and neglect, books too damaged to sell, china sets with pieces missing, nothing that would save them. But Nicole had kept exploring with the fearlessness of children who haven't learned that old houses can be dangerous, and in the parlor corner she'd found something that made Melissa stop cold, a child's wooden toy, a carved horse on wheels sitting on a side table as if someone had just put it down. Did Uncle Kenneth have kids? Nicole's question had echoed in the empty room. Melissa had checked her mental family tree and come up empty. Kenneth had never married, had no children on any record she'd ever seen. So why would there be a child's toy in his house preserved and placed with care? The question was still unanswered when Shirley Allen walked up the driveway on their second day, carrying a casserole dish and wearing a smile that crinkled her eyes at the corners. She was somewhere north of 65, with white hair pulled back in a practical bun, dressed like someone who spent serious time in gardens, and she moved with the confidence of a woman who'd earned her place in the world through decades of showing up and doing the work. She introduced herself as the neighbor, explained she'd lived on the adjacent property for 40 years and that Kenneth Whitmore had visited exactly once per year to pay her $500 cash for maintaining the perimeter fence. Not the house, not the grounds, just the fence keeping the boundary clear and marked. "He wasn't crazy, dear." Shirley's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 4 decades defending a dead man's reputation to people who'd already made up their minds. He was terrified, said men in expensive suits watched the house at night, that they'd been circling for years, waiting for him to slip up. She'd handed Melissa a key, then small and brass, and attached to a tag with an address written in Kenneth's handwriting. A storage unit in town, climate-controlled, the monthly fees paid automatically from an account that had somehow survived Kenneth's supposed bankruptcy. Shirley had promised to give the key to whoever came, and now here Melissa was, holding another piece of a puzzle that kept getting stranger. Nicole had bonded with Shirley immediately over talk of gardens and roses, and the old woman's face had softened watching them together. "Your uncle loved roses, said they reminded him of his sister." Melissa's grandmother, dead 20 years now, buried next to Melissa's mother in a Chicago cemetery that Kenneth had never visited. The storage unit sat in a climate-controlled facility on the edge of town, the kind of place where people kept things they couldn't bear to throw away, but had no room to house. The monthly fees for a unit this size would have been substantial, and Kenneth had been paying them for decades. Why spend money you supposedly didn't have to store things in temperature-controlled darkness? Inside, Melissa found boxes, dozens of them, stacked with military precision and labeled in Kenneth's meticulous handwriting, financial records, 1975 to 1985, architectural blueprints, personal correspondence, legal documents. She'd started with the photographs, pulling out images that showed a different version of the story she'd been told. Kenneth, in his 30s, standing beside a tall man with cold eyes and a practiced smile. The back of the photo identified them, Kenneth Whitmore and William Kane, 1974, signing partnership papers for Whitmore Kane Shipping. They looked like friends, like partners building something together. Later, photos told a different story. The same 2 men, but Kenneth's face in these had been marked with red X's, violent slashes that nearly tore through the paper. Handwritten notes in the margins, "Tommy betrayed me, stole everything, they'll pay." Nicole had found the diary while Melissa was sorting through financial records. A child's journal pink with age belonging to Melissa's grandmother when she was young. The entries were mundane until 1975, when Kenneth had introduced his little sister to his new business partner. Tommy seems charming, but his eyes are cold. Kenny trusts him. I don't. Years of entries documenting a friendship that soured a partnership that curdled into something poisonous. The final entry from 1984 made Melissa's hands shake. Kenny called crying. Tommy destroyed him. Embezzlement charges. Board voted him out. I told Kenny to fight back. He said he has a plan. Nicole's voice had been small, reading over her mother's shoulder. So, the bad guy stole from Uncle Kenneth first? Melissa had nodded, unable to speak, past the tightness in her throat. The story she'd been told her whole life was unraveling, and underneath it, something darker was emerging. Kenneth hadn't gone crazy and squandered a fortune. Someone had destroyed him deliberately, and he'd spent the rest of his life doing what the blueprints answered that question in a way that made no sense at all. Original architectural drawings for Whitmore Manor from 1892, beautiful pen and ink work showing every detail of the Victorian structure. But overlaid on top in Kenneth's handwriting from 1986 were additions that shouldn't exist. Sub-level reinforcement, blast-rated steel installation, independent power generation, climate control systems, lead-lined ventilation with exhaust routing through existing chimneys. Melissa had done mental math, calculating construction costs for the materials specified, millions of dollars. Multiple millions to build what Kenneth was describing, all of it hidden, all of it secret. Where did a bankrupt man get the money to construct something like this? And more importantly, where the hell was it? They'd returned to the manor with the blueprints, and Melissa had walked every floor looking for signs of Kenneth's construction. Nothing matched. No steel, no generators, no climate control, beyond the original radiator system that hadn't functioned in decades. The space described in the blueprints simply didn't exist anywhere she could find. On the fourth day, she'd forced open the library door. The room looked like a bomb had gone off in slow motion. Books torn apart, pages scattered across a Persian rug, gone threadbare, with aged furniture overturned and drawers pulled out and emptied. But the desk had survived intact, buried under stacks of leather-bound ledgers that Melissa had pulled free one by one, each volume adding another piece to a picture that kept getting more impossible. They weren't gambling debts. They weren't the financial records of a man losing his mind. They were purchase orders meticulously documented for industrial construction materials acquired between 1985 and 1988. March 4th, 1986, 4,000 pounds. Bessemer Steel Supports Contractor Number 4 paid cash. $23,000, April 12, 1987. 2 Caterpillar diesel generators, military specification, $47,000, June 18, 1987. Lead-lined ventilation system, independent exhaust routing. Contractor number 6, $31,000, August 9, 1987. Contractor asked questions about building permits. Terminated contract. Materials delivered to alternative location. Hired contractor number 7 with better references. Nicole had been reading over her shoulder, her 9-year-old brain processing what Melissa's was refusing to accept. Mom, what's he building? A bunker. A vault. Something designed to survive and hide and keep secrets safe for decades. But where was it? The house had been searched, measured, documented. There was no hidden sub-level, no massive steel structure, no generators humming in darkness. The final ledger entry had been written in handwriting that deteriorated across the page, Kenneth's neat script decaying into something frantic and barely legible. September 12, 1990. They're circling. The wolves can smell blood now. William sent his lawyers with papers. I won't sign. The gallery is sealed forever. Let them believe I'm bankrupt. Let them think I'm mad. The hollow wall will guard what they cannot find. If anyone worthy finds this, make them pay for what they did to those men. Nicole had pointed at the phrase, her finger steady on words that made Melissa's skin crawl. The hollow wall. Melissa had looked up from the journal and really seen the library for the first time. The north wall was completely covered by a massive mahogany bookcase that appeared built into the architecture itself, floor to ceiling, and probably 10 feet wide, filled with books that had been torn apart and scattered. Original to the house or added later. The wood was too dark with age to tell, and the craftsmanship was too good to reveal its secrets easily. Nicole had started pulling books off shelves, looking for hidden switches like in her mystery novels, but nothing budged or clicked or revealed anything. Melissa had tried measuring by hand, pacing the room's dimensions and comparing them to the exterior, but the numbers kept coming up wrong. There was space missing somewhere, maybe 6 feet of depth, that existed on the outside, but not the inside. The words slipped out before she could stop them. There's something behind that wall, but confirmation would have to wait. The sound of tires on gravel had pulled them both to the window, and Melissa's stomach had dropped, watching a black Mercedes sedan glide up the driveway like a shark cutting through water. Christopher Kane emerged in a suit that probably cost more than Melissa made in 3 months. Silver hair perfectly styled, despite the humidity smile, practiced and predatory. Nicole had pressed close to her mother's side immediately, 9-year-old instincts recognizing danger before conscious thought caught up. He'd introduced himself on the sagging porch, handed over a business card, embossed with expensive lettering, Christopher Kane, CEO, Apex Development Corporation. Said he'd been keeping an eye on the property for years, knew about Melissa's situation with the back taxes and the 30-day deadline. Then he'd made his offer, $200,000 cash, immediate closing. She could sign the deed over today and walk away tomorrow, all her debts erased, all her problems solved. Melissa's heart had done terrible things in her chest because $200,000 was life-changing money. It was Nicole's college fund and a real apartment, and never having to choose between electricity and groceries again. It was freedom from the crushing weight that had been sitting on her shoulders since her mother's diagnosis, since the divorce, since every single thing had gone wrong at once. Nicole had tugged at her sleeve, wordless but insistent, and whispered loud enough for only Melissa to hear, "Mom, no." Christopher had taken them on a tour of the grounds, then talking about development plans and property values and the Hudson Valley real estate market. His words had been smooth and professional until he'd made a mistake so small that anyone else would have missed it. Standing near the overgrown gardens, gesturing at the foundation he'd let slip. Shame about the sub-basement flooding in the 90s. Completely destroyed the structural foundation. We'll need excavators to remove the debris before building. Melissa's historian brain had caught it instantly, turned it over, examined it from every angle. The blueprints she'd studied showed no sub-basement. The Hudson Valley bedrock was too dense for deep excavation without explosives and permits that would have left public records. There was no sub-basement. Christopher Kane was lying, which meant he knew something about this house that he wasn't supposed to know. She'd stalled, said she needed time to think about it. His mask had slipped then, just for a second, and underneath the professional veneer, something cold and vicious had looked out at her. "Don't be foolish, Miss Thompson." His voice had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that carries more threat than shouting ever could. "This area has accidents, old houses collapse. Single mothers with young daughters should prioritize safety above all else." The implicit threat toward Nicole had been unmistakable, and Melissa had felt something shift inside her chest, something that had nothing to do with money or fear or the crushing weight of poverty. He'd threatened her child. That was the line that couldn't be uncrossed. Christopher had left his card, said he'd return tomorrow at noon for her answer, and driven away with gravel, spitting from under his tires. Melissa had stood on the porch, shaking, while Nicole pressed against her side, both of them watching the dust settle in the driveway. "I don't like him, Mommy." Nicole hadn't called her Mommy in over a year, had been insisting on Mom with the dignity of impending double digits. "He looked at our house like he wanted to eat it, and he looked at me like—" Melissa had knelt down, held her daughter's face between her hands, and made herself ask, "Like what, baby? Like I was in his way?" The decision had crystallized in that moment, hard and sharp and absolutely certain. They weren't signing anything. They weren't taking the money. There was something hidden in this house that Christopher Kane wanted desperately enough to threaten a 9-year-old child, and Melissa was going to find it even if she had to tear the whole goddamn building apart, brick by brick. That night, while Nicole slept in a sleeping bag on the parlor floor, Melissa had paced the library with a tape measure and Kenneth's journal, and a growing certainty that she was missing something obvious. The phrase kept repeating in her head, "The hollow wall will guard what they cannot find." She'd measured the exterior north wall from outside 45 feet, measured the library interior 39 feet. 6 feet of space that existed architecturally, but didn't exist functionally. A gap, a void, a hollow. When Nicole had woken at 3 a.m. and found her mother still measuring, she'd watched for a while before asking in a sleep-rough voice, "What are you doing? The math doesn't work." Melissa had pointed at her notes, the numbers that refused to reconcile. "There's missing space, 6 feet of wall that should be here but isn't. Like a secret room, maybe, or just weird Victorian construction. But Christopher Kane knows it exists, which means it's real and it's valuable, and he's willing to threaten us to get it." They'd spent the rest of the night examining the mahogany bookcase, pulling books and pushing panels, and searching for the hidden mechanism that had to exist somewhere. Nancy drew logic. Nicole had called it remembering her mystery novels, where secret passages always had trick triggers. But nothing worked. Nothing budged. The wall stood solid and unmovable, keeping its secrets locked behind 2 inches of mahogany and a century of silence. By dawn, Melissa had made her decision. She'd driven to the hardware store in town and bought a sledgehammer, heavy and brutal, the kind of tool used for demolition rather than construction. The teenager at the register had looked at her with the particular concern reserved for obvious disasters in progress, but he'd taken her money and wished her luck anyway. Nicole had insisted on staying for the actual work, had refused to wait outside or go visit Shirley, or do anything except be present when her mother destroyed what might be the last valuable thing in the house. They were partners, she'd said with 9-year-old gravity. They'd started this together, and they'd finish it together. Melissa had sent her to cover her ears anyway, had positioned her behind the overturned desk where flying debris wouldn't reach, and stood facing the mahogany bookcase with the sledgehammer heavy in her hands. If she was wrong about this, she was destroying a priceless antique for nothing. If she was right, she was about to discover whatever Kenneth Whitmore had spent millions of dollars and 30 years of his life protecting. The first swing shattered wood that had been carefully joined by craftsmen who'd been dead for a century. The sound echoed through the empty house like breaking bones, and mahogany splinters rained across the Persian rug in pieces too small to ever repair. Melissa swung again and again, putting her shoulders into it, putting every ounce of rage and fear and desperate hope into destroying this beautiful thing. The bookcase came apart under her assault, revealing old wallpaper behind it. Floral patterns faded to ghosts. She'd switched to the crowbar, then jamming it into the plaster and pulling backward with all her weight. The wall came apart in chunks, ancient lath, and crumbling plaster exploding in clouds of white dust that coated everything, made breathing difficult, turned the air itself into something solid. And then the air changed. A rush of cold from the gap she'd created, smelling nothing like the rest of the house. Not mildew and rot and decades of neglect, but something else entirely, ozone and machine oil and the particular scent of sealed spaces that had been waiting in darkness for someone to finally break through. Melissa had frozen with the crowbar still in her hands, staring at what her flashlight beam revealed through the jagged hole. Heavy steel, industrial, and purpose-built, where there should have been nothing but brick and timber. A door, slightly ajar, that had been hidden behind the wall since 1990, when Kenneth had sealed it and walked away from everything he'd built. Beyond the door, descending into absolute darkness, a wrought iron spiral staircase disappeared downward into depths that shouldn't exist beneath a Victorian mansion built on Hudson Valley bedrock. Nicole had appeared at her elbow, too brave or too curious to stay hidden. "Are we going down?" Melissa had looked at her daughter, thought about Christopher Kane's threat, about Kenneth's warning, about the choice between safety and truth. Every instinct screamed to run to take Nicole and drive away and never look back. But 30 years ago, a man had built this in secret, had spent his fortune and his reputation, and probably his sanity, protecting whatever waited at the bottom of these stairs. The least she could do was find out if he'd been right. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Yes, together, carefully, right now." They descended into darkness that swallowed their flashlight beams, and with every step downward, Melissa counted the ways this could go wrong, the ways she might be leading her daughter into something neither of them would survive. The air grew colder as they dropped below the foundation, below the bedrock, into spaces that officially didn't exist. Nicole counted steps out loud, her child's voice echoing off steel and stone. 20, 30, 40. At the bottom, 50 feet below the library floor, they stood facing a blast door that belonged in a military installation or a Cold War bunker. Melissa wedged her crowbar into the gap and pushed, and the door screamed open on hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades. Pitch darkness waited beyond. She swept her flashlight across the void and caught glimpses of concrete steel machinery that looked maintained despite the years. Found the electrical panel mounted on the wall, industrial switches that controlled something vast and hidden. Her hand hovered over the main breaker, for a long moment before commitment won over caution. The generator coughed to life with a sound like thunder underground. Fluorescent lights flickered on in sequence row after row, illuminating a space that shouldn't exist, revealing the secret that Kenneth Whitmore had died protecting. The vault stretched 40 feet in every direction. Concrete walls, reinforced with riveted steel, plating a mahogany conference table sitting incongruously in the center like someone had moved their boardroom underground. 6 massive Mosler safes lined the perimeter, their combination dials gleaming under the fluorescent glare. Industrial ventilation hummed to life, cycling air through a system that had been waiting decades to function again. Nicole's assessment was immediate and accurate. "This is like Batman's cave." Melissa could only nod, historian brain trying to calculate the cost of what she was seeing. Multiple millions, maybe $10 or $15 million in 1980s construction, all of it hidden, all of it secret, all of it built by a man the world had dismissed as a paranoid lunatic who'd gambled away his fortune. Whatever Kenneth had been protecting it was here. In this impossible room, 50 feet beneath a condemned Victorian mansion, waiting for someone worthy enough to find it. The real question was whether Christopher Kane knew it existed and what he'd be willing to do to claim it. Outside, unseen and unheard gravel crunched in the driveway as a black Mercedes returned ahead of schedule. The far wall stopped Melissa's breath completely. Floor to ceiling covered in corkboards and photographs and newspaper clippings connected by red yarn in patterns that looked like madness until you stepped back and saw the architecture of obsession. Kenneth hadn't just been investigating something. He'd been building a case meticulously documented, every connection traced and verified and preserved for whoever finally found this place. Nicole moved toward it like gravity was pulling her, and Melissa followed, because leaving her daughter alone down here felt impossible. Up close, the scale became overwhelming. Hundreds of documents, decades of collected evidence, all centered on a single name that appeared again and again in different contexts, different decades, different crimes. Kane. The photographs showed Christopher's face younger, but recognizably predatory, standing beside an older man who shared his cold eyes and practiced smile. The back of one photo identified them in Kenneth's precise handwriting: William Kane and Christopher Kane, 1982, Apex Holdings Headquarters, grand opening. Father and son, building an empire on foundations that Kenneth had apparently spent 30 years proving were built on corpses. Newspaper clippings formed a timeline of corporate success. Kane Development wins Hudson Dam contract, $40 million project. Apex Holdings expands East Coast portfolio. William Kane named Businessman of the Year by Chamber of Commerce. The articles painted a picture of respectable wealth, legitimate business philanthropy, and civic contributions. But underneath, pinned with red yarn connections, were different documents entirely. Bank transfers routing through Cayman Islands accounts. Credit Suisse statements showing shell companies moving money in circles designed to hide origins and destinations. Photocopied ledgers that Kenneth had somehow obtained showing the real accounting behind Apex Holdings' public success. Every legitimate dollar appeared to have a shadow twin money that flowed through channels specifically designed to be untraceable. Nicole's finger traced one of the yarn lines, following it from a photograph of William Kane to a newspaper article that made Melissa's stomach turn over. Hudson Valley Dam collapse kills 7 workers, 1989. The official report blamed unforeseen geological factors, structural failure that couldn't have been predicted or prevented. An engineering tragedy, the article called it, an act of God. Kenneth's handwritten notes in the margin told a different story. Red ink practically burning through the paper with rage murder. They knew load-bearing walls cut 40% to pocket $2.3 million. They killed those men for profit. Melissa found the engineering reports, next photocopies of documents that should have been confidential. Before and after blueprints showing where specifications had been changed, where safety margins had been eliminated, where concrete thickness had been reduced, and steel reinforcement had been cut. Every modification calculated to save money while pushing the structure right to the edge of catastrophic failure. The photographs of the victims' families at funerals made it real in a way the technical documents couldn't. 7 men dead because William Kane had decided their lives were worth less than $2 million in construction savings. Nicole's voice came out small and careful, the way children sound when processing adult horrors. What does catastrophic failure mean? Melissa knelt beside her daughter, searching for age-appropriate honesty. Very bad things happened because someone was greedy. These men died because the wall wasn't built strong enough, and it wasn't built strong enough because someone wanted to keep the money instead. The timeline on the wall showed Kenneth's investigation spreading over decades, each new piece of evidence building on the last. He'd started with the dam disaster, but that had led him backward through Kane family history, uncovering patterns that repeated across different projects, different companies, different decades. 1975. Kenneth and William Kane form partnership Whitmore Kane Shipping. The photographs from this era showed genuine friendship. 2 young men building something together with optimism that looked painful in retrospect. 1982. Kenneth discovers accounting irregularities. Confronts William privately. Annotated financial records showed discrepancies that Kenneth had highlighted in yellow differences between reported revenue and actual cash flow that suggested systematic embezzlement. 1984. Kenneth threatens to report findings to the board. William Kane orchestrates hostile takeover. The board meeting minutes showed a coordinated attack directors who'd been bribed or threatened, all voting to remove Kenneth from his own company. 1985. False embezzlement charges filed against Kenneth. The legal documents were vicious, accusing him of the exact crimes William had committed, using Kenneth's own investigation against him as evidence of guilt. 1986. Kenneth begins vault construction. Evidence collection accelerates. The purchase ledgers they'd found upstairs started here, millions of dollars liquidated and converted into this underground fortress. 1989. Dam collapses. 7 workers dead. Kenneth obtains proof of intentional safety violations. The evidence included witness statements from fired contractors, photographs of the substandard construction, recorded conversations that Kenneth had somehow acquired. 1990. Kenneth liquidates all remaining assets, goes bankrupt, disappears from public life. The final newspaper article showed him disheveled and broken, being escorted from his Manhattan office by security. The world had believed the performance completely. Melissa traced the yarn connections, watching patterns emerge. Every contractor who'd questioned the dam specifications had been fursured. Every inspector who'd raised concerns had been paid off or replaced. Every witness who might have testified had been intimidated into silence or bought into compliance. William Kane had been thorough, systematic, absolutely ruthless in his corruption, and Kenneth had documented every single piece of it. Nicole pointed to cassette tapes in plastic evidence bags, labeled in Kenneth's handwriting. Kane Inspector Conversations, 1987 to 1988. Proof of bribery preserved on magnetic tape for 3 decades, waiting for someone to finally make it matter. The realization hit Melissa like physical impact. Kenneth hadn't gone crazy. He'd gone underground, built this fortress, collected evidence that would destroy the Kane family empire, and waited for someone worthy to find it. Someone who wouldn't take the easy money, someone who'd fight. Her voice came out rough with understanding. He was trying to catch the spider for 30 years. The 6 Mosler safes dominated the opposite wall, industrial and imposing, their combination dials gleaming under fluorescent light. 5 were Loctite, their doors sealed with the mechanisms that would require professional safe crackers or explosives to bypass. But the 6th safe, smallest in the row, stood with its heavy door swung wide in deliberate invitation. Inside sat a leather briefcase and an envelope resting on top, both positioned with the kind of care that suggested ceremony rather than simple storage. Melissa's hands shook opening the envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind that survived decades without yellowing. Kenneth's handwriting covered both sides in his characteristic precision, though the script showed signs of age. Slight tremors that spoke to hands no longer completely steady. The letter began with stark honesty. "If you're reading this, I am dead, and the vultures are finally circling the corpse." She read aloud so Nicole could hear both of them, needing to understand what Kenneth had left behind. The words painted a picture of systematic destruction. William Kane hadn't just stolen from Kenneth, he'd orchestrated a campaign to dismantle everything the Whitmore name represented. False charges, board manipulation, character assassination conducted with such precision that the entire world had believed Kenneth deserved his ruin. But Kenneth's next words changed everything. "I did not lose my mind. I did not lose our fortune." He'd liquidated, deliberately converting real estate and shipping contracts and art collections into something more portable, more secure. Everything valuable had been transformed into paper that could hide in a briefcase, wealth that existed only for whoever physically held the certificates. Inside this briefcase, $40 million in bearer bonds, legal, untraceable. Whoever physically holds the paper owns the wealth. Melissa opened the briefcase with hands that wouldn't stay steady. The hinges popped with a sound that echoed off concrete walls, revealing stacks of certificates in protective sleeves, each one ornate and official, and representing more money than she'd ever imagined touching. Nicole peered inside 9-year-old brain, trying to process numbers that didn't translate to normal life. "Is that a lot?" The laugh that came out of Melissa sounded hysterical even to her own ears. "Baby, we can pay for college, buy a house, eat real food. Never worry about rent or bills or choosing between electricity and groceries ever again." Nicole's arms wrapped around her waist, small and fierce. "Uncle Kenneth saved us." The truth of it settled into Melissa's bones. Yes, a man she'd never met had spent 30 years protecting wealth and evidence, had built this fortress and hidden it perfectly, had endured being called crazy and broken and lost all, so that whoever finally found this place would have the resources to finish what he'd started. Beneath the bonds, a black metal tin contained the physical proof microfiche reels preserving the dam, investigation documents, photographs showing inspectors accepting cash payments, cassette tapes with conversations that proved premeditated murder for profit. Kenneth's letter continued with instructions, warnings, and a final command that made Melissa's blood run cold. Make them pay for what they did to those men. She'd been so focused on the vault contents that the phone ringing nearly stopped her heart. The sound came from the conference table, an actual landline telephone sitting beside a bank of old monitors, the cord running into the wall, toward whatever external connection Kenneth had secretly maintained. Melissa stared at it for 3 rings before finding the courage to answer. The voice on the other end was male, older, carrying the particular roughness of someone who'd spent too many years teaching. "Ms. Thompson, this is Jonathan Wright. Shirley gave me this number. I hope I'm not interrupting." She'd met him 3 days ago at the Hudson Valley Library. A local historian in his 50s with kind eyes and a gray beard who'd helped her research Whitmore family history without asking too many questions about why she needed to know. He'd seemed nervous when she'd mentioned Kenneth had warned her that the Kane family owned half the county and to be careful who she trusted. Now his voice carried urgency that made her grip the phone tighter. "I've been thinking about our conversation, about your uncle, about what you might find in that house." Melissa made herself speak carefully, aware that whoever found this vault would be in danger. "What do you know about Kenneth?" A long pause, then words that came out weighted with decades of grief. "My father was one of the 7 men killed when that dam collapsed. Robert Wright. Structural engineer. He tried to report the safety violations, got fired for his trouble, took a lower position just to feed us. He died when the wall gave out because someone had cut corners to save money." The connection clicked into place with sickening clarity. Jonathan had spent his entire adult life knowing his father's death wasn't an accident, watching the Kane family prosper, while victims' families struggled, waiting for someone to finally prove what everyone suspected but couldn't touch. His voice steadied with purpose. Workers talked after the collapse about what they'd seen during construction. Inspectors who got paid to look the other way. Contractors who refused to cut corners and got replaced by ones who would. But nobody could prove anything. The Kanes owned the investigation, owned the officials, owned the narrative. Melissa looked at the evidence spread across the conspiracy wall. 30 years of documentation that Jonathan's father had died trying to expose what if someone had proof. Real proof that couldn't be dismissed or buried. Then they'd need to take it straight to federal authorities. Jonathan's answer came fast, like he'd been waiting years to say it. "Don't go to local police. Deputy Richard Miller is on Kane payroll. Don't trust county officials. The corruption runs deep enough that you need jurisdiction they can't touch." The warning settled into strategy. FBI, then. Federal crimes, federal evidence, federal prosecution that the Kane family couldn't buy or intimidate. "If you have what I think you have," Jonathan continued, "I'll testify. I'll help any way I can. My father deserves justice. Those other 6 men deserve justice. Kenneth deserves to be remembered as a hero instead of a cautionary tale." Melissa ended the call with promises to contact him soon and turned to find Nicole examining the bank of monitors on the conference table. The screens were dark, ancient cathode ray tubes that probably dated from the 1980s when Kenneth had installed this entire system. Nicole's curiosity had found the power switch before Melissa could stop her. The monitors flickered to life, one by one, displaying grainy black and white feeds from cameras hidden throughout the manor. 6 different views, 6 different rooms, all showing angles that would have taken serious planning to install without anyone noticing. Screen 1 showed the foyer, where they'd first entered. Screen 2 captured the grand staircase. Screen 3 displayed the library with its destroyed wall and the gaping hole they'd torn to reach this place. Screen 4 covered the kitchen entrance. Screen 5 watched the front driveway. Screen 6 monitored the rear grounds near the old carriage house ruins. Melissa was cataloging camera positions when Nicole's voice went tight with fear. "Mom, Screen 5. Headlights cut through gathering dusk, a black Mercedes gliding up the driveway 12 hours ahead of schedule. Christopher Kane stepped out, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 men emerged with him, both large and purposeful, in the way people move when violence is their profession. The bigger one carried a crowbar. Both had bulges under their jackets that suggested firearms. Nicole's hand found Melissa's small fingers gripping hard. "I am scared." The admission made it real in a way that seeing the car hadn't. Melissa pulled her daughter close, watching the monitors as Christopher and his men approached the house, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the situation. This wasn't a business negotiation. This was something much more dangerous. The audio feed crackled to life as the front door exploded inward under a brutal kick. Christopher's voice echoed through the hidden microphones Kenneth had installed decades ago, reaching them 50 feet underground. "Search the house, every room, find them." The larger man's response came through clearly. "First floor, clear, Mr. Kane." Christopher's patience sounded thin. "Upstairs, then. Tear up floorboards if you have to. Her car's outside, so they're here somewhere." Melissa watched Screen 2 as both men ascended the staircase, their movements efficient and practiced. These weren't just hired muscle. They were professionals, and the casual way the wiry one checked his weapon suggested they'd done this kind of work before. The audio picked up their conversation as they searched. "What do we do when we find them?" Christopher's answer made Melissa clamp a hand over her mouth to stop the sound that wanted to escape. "Make it look like structural collapse. Break the woman's neck, the child too. No witnesses. This ends tonight." Nicole's entire body went rigid against her mother's side. At 9 years old, she understood enough to know that bad people sometimes hurt children, but hearing it stated so casually, so matter-of-factly, was different than abstract fear. Melissa found her voice, despite the terror trying to strangle it. "We're safe down here. He can't get to us." But even as she said it, heavy footsteps crossed directly overhead. Screen 3 showed the larger man entering the library, his flashlight beam sweeping across destruction until it caught on the massive hole they'd torn in the wall. He stopped dead, staring at the exposed steel door and the spiral staircase descending into darkness. His shout brought Christopher running. "Boss, up here! You need to see this!" Christopher's face when he saw what they'd found was terrible in its naked hunger. All pretense of civilized negotiation stripped away, leaving only greed and rage and vindication. His whisper barely reached the microphones. "The bastard really built it. 30 years we've searched." He turned to his men with orders that confirmed every suspicion Melissa had built. "Down there, both of you. Find them." The wiry one hesitated. "What if there's another exit?" "Then you'd better move fast." Christopher's patience had completely evaporated. If they've seen what's down there, they know too much. No negotiations. No mercy. Kill them both and make it look like the house fell on them. Melissa's brain shifted into survival mode with crystal clarity. The briefcase full of bearer bonds sat where she'd left it, and Kenneth's letter had mentioned mechanisms: green lever seals, the perimeter, red wheel opens the escape path. She grabbed the briefcase, secured it across her body with the shoulder strap, and searched the vault for anything green. The control console, beside the generator, held multiple switches and levers, but only one was painted bright green with a handle worn smooth by testing. Melissa gripped it with both hands while Nicole pressed against her back, watching the monitors as Christopher's men started down the spiral staircase. Their boots rang against iron steps, getting louder with each descent. 40 steps from the top, 35, 30. Moving fast, but cautious, weapons drawn now, ready for whatever waited at the bottom. Melissa looked at Nicole one more time. "Cover your ears." She yanked the green lever down with everything she had. The mechanical siren that wailed through the vault was designed for nuclear attack warnings, loud enough to damage hearing at close range. Nicole screamed and clamped hands over ears, but the sound penetrated anyway, a howl of hydraulics and alerts that meant the fortress was sealing itself against invasion. The blast door began closing with the inevitability of tectonic plates shifting. 6 inches of steel and lead moving on tracks lubricated and maintained by systems Kenneth had built to last forever. Slow at first, then accelerating as enormous motors engaged fully. On the monitor, the larger man saw what was happening from halfway down the staircase. His face changed completely, professional, calm, giving way to panic. The door. Stop the door. He sprinted down remaining steps, weapon raised, and fired twice before conscious thought could override training. The bullets hit the closing door and ricocheted with sounds like bells breaking, sparking off steel that had been designed to survive nuclear war. One bullet shattered an overhead fluorescent tube, and glass rained down, while Melissa shielded Nicole behind the mahogany conference table. The blast door slammed shut with a sound like the earth splitting open. Massive deadbolts shot into place automatically, 8 inches of hardened steel sliding home in reinforced concrete, sealing the vault from inside with mechanisms that would require excavation equipment and days of work to bypass. Above them, muffled by tons of rock and steel, Christopher's voice carried through the audio feed in incoherent rage. Hammering started immediately, metal on metal, the futile sound of men attacking a barrier they had no hope of breaching. Nicole was crying quietly, pressed into Melissa's side, with her stuffed rabbit clutched like armor. Safe for the moment, but trapped 50 feet underground with no exit except through a door that wouldn't open, and men above who'd made their intentions brutally clear. Melissa forced herself to think past the fear. Kenneth's letter had mentioned 2 mechanisms. Green lever seals the perimeter. Red wheel opens the escape path. She'd used the green. Now she needed red. The vault's layout had seemed simple when they'd first arrived, but Kenneth's paranoia suggested nothing here would be straightforward. Melissa searched the perimeter, looking for anything that stood out, until she found it behind the conspiracy wall, a section of concrete that didn't quite match the rest. Smooth where it should have been, textured with a heavy industrial pipe running through it and terminating in a wheel valve painted bright red. She gripped the wheel with both hands and pulled. Nothing moved. Decades of rust had seized the mechanism, locking it solid, despite whatever lubrication Kenneth had applied 30 years ago. Melissa planted her feet against the wall for leverage and threw her full weight into the turn. The rust broke with a crack loud enough to echo, and suddenly The wheels spun freely. A hissing sound filled the vault as pressure equalized, and the section of wall beside the pipe swung outward on counterweights, revealing darkness beyond that smelled of wet earth and stone. A tunnel carved through solid bedrock, supported by timber beams that looked disturbingly old. Kenneth's escape route, the path he'd built, so that if everything went wrong, someone could still survive to finish his work. Melissa grabbed the flashlight, checked that the briefcase was secure, and pulled Nicole toward the opening. Above them, the hammering had stopped, replaced by Christopher's voice on his phone, calling for excavation equipment, promising money to anyone who could get cutting torches to the site within the hour. They had maybe 90 minutes before professional equipment would start eating through the blast door. Time to run, or time to get trapped in a tunnel that might not have an exit. Nicole's voice was steady, despite the tears still wet on her face. "Is this the way out?" Melissa kissed her daughter's forehead, tasting salt and dust. "This is the way we survive." The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness absolute, and Melissa led the way because there was no choice left except forward. The ceiling scraped low enough that she had to crouch, and Nicole stayed pressed against her back, with one hand fisted in Melissa's jacket. Water seeped through cracks in the stone, and the timber supports groaned under weight they'd been holding for 3 decades. Nicole counted steps to stay calm, her 9-year-old voice echoing off stone. 100, 200, 300. The tunnel curved gently eastward, sloping upward in gradual increments that suggested Kenneth had planned this route with precision. Every 10 feet, another timber support, every 20 feet, a slight bend that would prevent anyone at either end from seeing straight through. Military thinking applied to civilian escape, the kind of paranoia that only made sense when you knew powerful people were hunting you. Melissa's thigh muscles burned from the crouch walk, and her lungs ached from air that tasted of minerals and earth. Behind them, the sounds of the vault were fading, replaced by the absolute silence of being underground, of being buried alive in stone that had been solid before humans evolved. The flashlight beam caught movement ahead, and Melissa's heart seized before she realized it was just roots, pale and searching, hanging from the tunnel ceiling like the fingers of something trying to dig its way in. Nicole's counting had reached 800 when the tunnel began its final ascent, steep enough that Melissa had to use her hands on the floor to maintain balance. The air changed again, carrying hints of night and rain and living things instead of just rock and water. They hit a dead end. Wooden trapdoor, overhead roots, and soil packed against it, sealed by years of weather and neglect. Melissa braced her back against the tunnel wall, planted both feet against the wood, and pushed with everything left in her legs. The wood resisted, held then splintered with a sound like bones breaking. Dirt cascaded down on them, and cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain-soaked earth and freedom. Melissa pushed again, and the entire trapdoor broke apart, rotten wood giving way after decades of waiting for someone to finally use the exit Kenneth had built. They emerged into ruins of the old carriage house, collapsed walls, and rotting timbers, creating shelter from anyone watching the main house. Through gaps in the structure, Melissa could see the manor lit up like a beacon, every window glowing, as Christopher's men searched for them in rooms they'd already left behind. Nicole gulped night air, coughing dirt and relief in equal measure. Rain fell in steady sheets, washing away dust and fear, and Melissa pulled her daughter close for just a moment before survival instinct pushed them back into motion. The Honda Civic sat where they'd left it 200 yards away through woods and brambles. Melissa grabbed Nicole's hand and ran, branches tearing at their clothes and mud sucking at their shoes. Both of them focused only on reaching the car before Christopher realized they'd escaped. Keys fumbled from Melissa's pocket, slick with rain and shaking hands. The car door opened and they threw themselves inside locking doors with movements that felt automatic and insufficient. The engine turned over on the second try, and Melissa gunned it, tires spinning in mud, before catching traction. She checked the rearview mirror as they hit the main road, watching the manor recede into darkness. Lights still blazed in windows, where Christopher's men tore through rooms looking for victims who were already gone. By the time they realized the vault had a second exit, Melissa and Nicole would be hours away and accelerating toward safety. Nicole's voice came out small and shaking. "Where are we going?" Melissa's hands white-knuckled the steering wheel, adrenaline beginning to fade into exhaustion that felt like drowning. "New York City, Federal Building, we're ending this." The briefcase sat in the back seat with $40 million in bearer bonds and evidence that would destroy the Kane family empire. Kenneth had spent 30 years building a case that couldn't be ignored or buried. Now Melissa was going to make sure it reached people who couldn't be bought or intimidated, who had the jurisdiction and authority to do what local corruption had prevented for 3 decades. Christopher Kane had threatened her daughter. That was the line that couldn't be uncrossed, the mistake that transformed fear into fury, into absolute determination to see justice done regardless of cost. Nicole's hand found Melissa's on the gear shift, small fingers wrapping around larger ones. "Are they going to come after us?" The truth was probably yes, but the truth could wait until they weren't running for their lives through a thunderstorm with everything they owned in a decade-old Honda. Instead, Melissa said what her daughter needed to hear: "Not where we're going. The FBI will protect us." They drove through the night with rain hammering the windshield and the briefcase holding their future secured in the backseat. Behind them, Christopher Kane's men would eventually discover the tunnel and realize their prey had escaped, would report back to their boss that his threat had backfired spectacularly, that the woman he'd tried to intimidate was now running toward authorities with evidence he'd spent 30 years trying to destroy. But that was Christopher's problem now. Melissa's only concern was getting Nicole somewhere safe before exhaustion made her dangerous on the road, before fear caught up to adrenaline and left them both shaking too hard to function. The Manhattan skyline appeared on the horizon as dawn broke glass towers, catching first light and transforming into pillars of fire. Melissa drove straight to Federal Plaza and parked in a space marked for law enforcement, only too far past caring about parking tickets to worry about consequences that small. Nicole stirred from sleep as the engine cut out, her stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest. "We're really in New York!" Melissa checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, mud-streaked face hair matted with dirt and sweat jacket, torn from branches and brambles. She looked like she'd been through a war, which was essentially accurate. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Time to be brave one more time." They walked into the Federal Building at 6:47 a.m., looking like disaster survivors, which they were. And the security guard took one look at Melissa's face before asking with professional concern, "Can I help you?" The words came out clear, Despite everything, I need to speak with someone from the white-collar crime division. I have evidence of corporate fraud manslaughter and attempted murder. It's urgent. Special Agent Catherine Reeves had the kind of eyes that cataloged everything without seeming to look directly at anything. Mid-40s sharp suit that managed to appear professional without trying, she took in Melissa's mud-streaked appearance and Nicole's exhausted face with an assessment that felt clinical rather than judgmental. The conference room on the 7th floor smelled like burned coffee and old paper windows overlooking Federal Plaza, where morning commuters rushed past completely unaware that justice was about to land on the Kane family like an avalanche. Catherine set down hot chocolate for Nicole and coffee for Melissa, with movements that suggested this wasn't her first time interviewing traumatized witnesses. Her voice carried authority, tempered by something that might have been genuine compassion. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Melissa laid it out chronologically, fighting exhaustion that made words feel slippery. The inheritance she'd thought was worthless. Kenneth's ledgers documenting construction that shouldn't exist. Christopher Kane's offer and the threat embedded in his warning about single mothers. The hidden vault, 50 feet underground, containing evidence and bearer bonds. The audio recording of Christopher ordering their execution. The escape through a tunnel carved from bedrock. Catherine called in her team halfway through Melissa's explanation. 3 more agents materialized with notepads and recording equipment, a forensic accountant who looked simultaneously bored and deeply focused. The briefcase full of bearer bonds hit the conference table, and everyone's attention sharpened instantly, because $40 million in negotiable certificates commanded respect even from people who dealt in corporate fraud daily. But it was the evidence that transformed professional interest into something hungrier. Melissa spread Kenneth's documentation across the table like dealing cards, microfiche reels containing the original dam investigation photographs showing cash changing hands between William Kane and county inspectors' cassette tapes labeled with dates and participants' ledgers documenting the real accounting behind Apex Holdings' public success. 30 years of obsessive investigation laid out for people who had the power to actually use it. The forensic accountant examined the bearer bonds, first handling them with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what they represented. These are legitimate, issued between 1985 and 1989 before bearer instruments were restricted. Whoever physically possesses these certificates owns the value. No electronic trail, no taxation until liquidation completely legal, despite being effectively untraceable. Catherine studied the microfiche against a light table she'd pulled from somewhere, scrolling through frame after frame of engineering reports that showed specifications, changed safety margins, eliminated concrete thickness, reduced. Her jaw tightened as the scope became clear. This is premeditated. They knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. Nicole had been quiet through most of the explanation, exhaustion and trauma keeping her small and still in a chair too large for her. But Catherine knelt beside her with the particular gentleness adults use around children who've seen too much. Nicole, can you tell me what Mr. Kane said to you and your mother? The question brought it all back, and Nicole's voice came out younger than 9 should sound. He said single mothers with daughters should be careful. He looked at me like I was a problem he needed to fix. And then last night we heard him tell his men to kill us both and make it look like the house fell down. Catherine's expression didn't change, but something cold moved behind her eyes, the kind of fury that came from years of seeing children threatened by adults who should have protected them. She stood and addressed her team with clipped efficiency. Get warrants drafted for Apex Holdings headquarters, Christopher Kane's residence and vehicles, all associated properties. Contact the U.S. Attorney's Office and tell them we're bringing RICO charges against the entire Kane organization. I want forensic accountants on their books and agents reviewing every project they've touched in the last 40 years. The room erupted into controlled chaos, agents making calls and typing warrants and coordinating with prosecutors. Melissa watched it unfold with a strange detachment born from exhaustion and the surreal quality of watching something enormous finally move after being stuck for 3 decades. Catherine returned her attention to Melissa with focus that felt complete. Ms. Thompson, you did exactly the right thing coming here. What you've handed us is a gift. We've been trying to build a RICO case against the Kane family for 8 years. Every time we get close, witnesses recant, or evidence disappears, or key players die in convenient accidents. You just solved all those problems simultaneously. The words should have felt like victory, but Melissa's brain was too tired to process anything except the immediate need to keep Nicole safe. What happens now? Now we put you both in protective custody while warrants are executed. Catherine's tone left no room for argument. Safe house in Queens? 24-hour federal marshal protection. Christopher Kane made credible threats against a minor witness to multiple federal crimes. He's not getting anywhere near either of you. The safe house turned out to be a nondescript apartment in a building that could have been anywhere, protected by marshals who looked bored until you noticed how their eyes never stopped moving. Melissa and Nicole crashed into exhausted sleep on a couch that smelled like industrial cleaner, both of them too drained to even make it to the bedroom. 48 hours later, the news broke nationwide with the kind of media frenzy usually reserved for political scandals or celebrity disasters. Melissa watched it unfold on a television that only got basic cable. Nicole pressed against her side, eating cereal that tasted like cardboard but was hot and plentiful. The headlines scrolled across every network: corporate dynasty exposed, 30-year dam, disaster, cover-up, uncovered. Federal raids target Apex Holdings Empire, 7 dead workers, finally get justice. Footage showed federal agents streaming into Apex Holdings' Manhattan headquarters, boxes of evidence being loaded into trucks, executives led out in handcuffs with jackets over their heads in the traditional perp walk shame. Christopher Kane's arrest dominated the coverage. His face caught mid-snarl as marshals pushed him into a federal vehicle, all his practiced charm stripped away to reveal the predator underneath. But the detail that made Nicole sit up straight came from a reporter standing outside Whitmore Manor. In a bizarre twist, Christopher Kane and 2 associates were found by state police trapped in a sealed basement stairwell of this abandoned property, reportedly half-starved after 36 hours without food or water. Sources say Kane was attempting to access a hidden vault when the structure's security systems activated, sealing them inside. Nicole's whisper carried something that might have been satisfaction. Uncle Kenneth's trap worked. The arrest list kept growing as Catherine's team pulled threads and followed connections. Deputy Richard Miller, taken into custody at his home corruption charges, stacking up as agents found evidence of bribes dating back 15 years. 5 Apex Holdings executives charged with fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, asset seizures totaling $340 million across properties and accounts the Kane family had thought were untouchable. Jonathan Wright's face appeared during an evening news segment, standing outside the Hudson Valley Public Library where Melissa had first met him. His voice carried steady, despite visible emotion. "For 31 years I believed my father's death was an accident. Now I know it was murder." Kenneth Whitmore spent his life collecting proof that powerful people wanted buried. Melissa Thompson risked everything to bring that proof to light. 7 families finally have answers. 7 men finally have justice. Melissa found herself crying, watching him speak this man she barely knew who'd lost his father the same way she'd lost her mother to systems that valued profit over human life. Nicole's hand found hers, and they sat together in a safe house in Queens, watching the empire that had killed 7 men and threatened a 9-year-old child finally collapse under the weight of its own corruption. Brenda Wright appeared at the safe house 6 days after the arrests, carrying legal documents and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent a week putting out fires. She spread the paperwork across a kitchen table that wobbled on uneven legs and got straight to business. "The bearer bonds are completely legitimate. I've verified authenticity with the issuing institutions. Total face value is $40,247,000. The number was so large it stopped having meaning, transforming into something abstract rather than actual wealth. Melissa made herself focus on Brenda's explanation of the liquidation process, how converting physical certificates into liquid assets would take approximately 8 weeks through investment banks that specialized in handling unusual instruments. Nicole asked the question that mattered: what happens to all that money now? Brenda's smile carried warmth that seemed genuine rather than professional. "It belongs to you and your mother. You can do whatever you want with it." Nicole looked at Melissa with eyes that had seen too much violence, but somehow maintained their fundamental decency. "Can we help the families, the people who got hurt?" The suggestion hit Melissa like physical impact, pride and grief mixing into something that felt like drowning in the best possible way. Her daughter, who'd been threatened with murder and escaped through a tunnel underground, wanted to use their windfall to help strangers who'd suffered decades ago. Sometimes children understood justice better than adults ever could. Her voice came out rough. "Yes, sweetheart, that's exactly what we're going to do." The financial cleanup took weeks of work, with accountants and tax attorneys converting Kenneth's bearer bonds into legal wealth while ensuring every dollar was properly documented and taxed. Melissa's debts vanished: first $47,000 for her mother's medical bills, $38,000 in student loans, $8,000 in divorce legal fees. Numbers that had haunted her for years simply ceased to exist, paid in full, with money that had been waiting underground since before she was born. But it was establishing the Hudson Valley Dam Victims Memorial Fund that felt like fulfilling Kenneth's final command. $5 million set aside specifically to compensate the families of the 7 workers killed in 1989, with Jonathan Wright helping coordinate contact with relatives who'd scattered across the country in the decades since the disaster. Each family received $500,000, no strings attached, no requirement to sign away rights or remain silent. Just money and an apology that came 3 decades too late, but still mattered. The remaining funds established scholarships for victims' descendants, $25,000 per year for college tuition, ensuring that the children and grandchildren of murdered workers would have opportunities their ancestors had been denied. The memorial service at the dam site brought everyone together in a way that felt necessary despite the raw wounds it exposed. Jonathan stood beside the concrete structure that had killed his father and read 7 names aloud, giving each man a moment of recognition they'd been denied by official reports that blamed geology instead of greed. Melissa placed 7 white roses on the memorial plaque that now bore their names in bronze. Nicole beside her, holding her hand with grip that suggested understanding beyond her years. The Kane Empire's collapse played out across financial news with the kind of schadenfreude that came from watching the powerful finally face consequences. Apex Holdings stock crashed from $47 per share to 8 cents as investors fled. The board dissolved by federal order assets, frozen pending investigation into which properties had been acquired through fraud or intimidation. Civil lawsuits multiplied like infection, 23 filed in the first week alone. Dam victims' families bringing wrongful death claims, defrauded investors seeking securities fraud damages, environmental groups presenting evidence of illegal dumping that investigators had somehow missed, former employees detailing hostile work environments and wrongful terminations. The total civil liability estimates climbed past $800 million and kept rising. Christopher Kane's trial became the kind of media spectacle that dominated cable news for weeks. Federal prosecutors presented Kenneth's evidence with methodical precision, building a case so overwhelming that even expensive defense attorneys couldn't create reasonable doubt. Melissa testified for 4 hours, walking the jury through her discovery of the vault and the audio recording of Christopher ordering their execution. Nicole testified in closed session with victim advocacy specialists present, describing threats made against a child by a man who'd already murdered 7 men for profit. Jonathan took the stand and told his father's story, how Robert Wright had tried reporting safety violations and been fired for his integrity, how he'd taken a lower position just to keep feeding his family, how he'd died when corners cut for profit had caused a wall to fail. His voice never wavered, but tears ran freely, and half the jury was crying by the time he finished. The verdict came back after 3 hours of deliberation, guilty on all 47 counts. The judge's sentencing statement cut through Christopher's lawyer's objections with judicial fury. You murdered 7 men for profit, then attempted to murder a woman and child to hide your crimes. This sentence reflects the complete depravity of your actions and ensures you will never threaten another human being. 35 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole. Christopher Kane would be 85 years old before he walked free if he survived incarceration at all. Deputy Miller got 12 years for obstruction and conspiracy. The 2 enforcers who'd followed Christopher down that spiral staircase received 18 and 8 years respectively for attempted murder and weapons charges. Apex Holdings executives got sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years, and every single one faced civil liability that would strip them of everything they'd accumulated through corruption. 3 months after the trial ended, Melissa and Nicole drove back to Whitmore Manor on an October morning when autumn had painted the Hudson Valley in colors that looked too vivid to be real. The dirt road felt familiar now, despite having only traveled it twice, and when the house came into view, Nicole's assessment had changed completely. It doesn't look sad anymore. It looks like it's waiting for us. The restoration team was already on site at 15 specialists, examining structure and planning repair work that would take 18 months and cost nearly $3 million. Brandon Morrison, the contractor who'd warned Melissa about Christopher's attempt to bribe him into sabotage, walked them through the assessment with enthusiasm that suggested genuine love for the work. He pointed out details that needed attention: slate roof requiring 800 replacement tiles, sourced from original quarry's windows, needing custom reproduction to match 1890s. Specifications: brickwork, demanding repointing with historically accurate lime mortar. Every repair would be done properly, using period-appropriate materials and techniques, bringing the manor back to its Gilded Age glory, while updating invisible systems like electrical and plumbing to modern safety standards. Nicole claimed her bedroom immediately, a corner room with east-facing windows that would catch morning light. She described her vision with the confidence of someone who'd earned the right to design her own space bookshelves, floor-to-ceiling window seat for reading desk, for homework positioned to watch sunrise. Melissa listened to her daughter plan their future in a house that had nearly been their tomb, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what home meant. Not just shelter or security, but the physical embodiment of survival, of fighting for what mattered, of refusing to let fear dictate surrender. Brandon's voice pulled her back to practical concerns. "We should talk about the vault. What do you want done with it?" The question deserved serious consideration. That space 50 feet underground had saved their lives, had preserved Kenneth's evidence, had been the fortress from which justice had finally launched. Melissa's answer came with certainty, born from understanding what legacy actually meant. Preserve it exactly as we found it. Turn it into an educational archive. Future generations should understand what happened here, what corruption looks like, how one person standing against it can actually matter. Nicole's addition carried the weight of someone who'd lived through history rather than just studied it like a museum for Uncle Kenneth. The vault preservation became part of the restoration plan, installing proper ventilation and dehumidification while maintaining the conspiracy wall behind protective glass. Guided tours by appointment for school groups and researchers' audio recordings of Christopher's threats available through headphones for those who needed to understand how close justice had come to dying in darkness. Shirley Allen appeared during the second week of restoration work, carrying a lockbox that looked older than she was. Melissa invited her inside despite the construction chaos, and they sat in the one room Brandon's team hadn't yet touched, while Nicole made tea using a camping stove. The lockbox contained letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Shirley in Kenneth's precise handwriting. Annual missives delivered with the fence maintenance payments, explaining his investigation's progress, documenting evidence as he acquired it, leaving instructions for what to do if he died before justice was served. The final letter, dated 1 week before Kenneth's death, made Melissa's hands shake, reading it. "Shirley, if you're reading this, I'm finally gone. Watch for family. They'll come. Direct them to storage unit if they're worthy. Trust your instincts. You always could read people. Thank you for 40 years of friendship when everyone else believed the lies." Kay Shirley's voice carried 4 decades of loneliness and loyalty. "He was the smartest, kindest man I ever knew. Just terrified with good reason. Everyone called him crazy, but he was the sanest person in this valley, seeing truth that powerful people wanted hidden." Melissa had brought a check $75,000 as thanks for maintaining Kenneth's secret and trusting strangers with the key that unlocked everything. Shirley protested, but accepted, and the money transformed into practical support, funding the move into the carriage house apartment once restoration finished, ensuring she'd never worry about housing or medical care again. Nicole bonded with Shirley over gardens and history, spending afternoons learning about roses and hearing stories about Kenneth that painted a picture of the man behind the paranoia. Sometimes the people society dismissed as broken were simply the ones brave enough to see uncomfortable truths before everyone else could. The memorial ceremony happened on a spring morning 1 year after Melissa had first broken through that library wall. 200 people gathered at the restored manor, victims' families and federal agents and local officials who'd finally acknowledged Kenneth's heroism now that doing so was politically safe. Jonathan Wright spoke first, his father's story carrying weight it had been denied for 3 decades. Catherine Reeves discussed the importance of whistleblowers and the courage required to stand against corruption, even when standing meant losing everything. Victims' families shared memories of men who died doing honest work for dishonest employers, gratitude mixing with grief that justice had taken so long to arrive. Then Nicole walked to the podium, 11 years old now, and taller than she'd been in that vault, wearing a dress Melissa had bought for occasions that mattered. Her voice carried through speakers to reach everyone gathered. "I never met my great-great-uncle Kenneth, but I know he was one of the bravest people who ever lived." She spoke about seeing terrible things and choosing to document them instead of looking away, about collecting proof, while everyone called him insane, about building a fortress to protect truth when powerful people wanted it buried. Her words painted Kenneth not as a cautionary tale, but as a hero who'd understood that individual courage could eventually triumph over institutional corruption. The conclusion carried wisdom beyond her years. "Uncle Kenneth taught me that one person really can make a difference, even against powerful bad guys, even when everyone thinks you're wrong. He never stopped fighting for truth, and because he didn't, 7 families finally got justice, and my mom and I are standing here instead of being buried in unmarked graves." The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes, and Melissa cried, watching her daughter receive recognition for survival that should never have been necessary. Sometimes the greatest inheritance wasn't money or property, but the example of how to fight for what mattered, regardless of cost. The Kenneth Whitmore Memorial Archive opened that afternoon, guided tours through the vault where conspiracy wall and evidence remained preserved behind protective glass. School groups scheduled visits months in advance, studying corporate accountability and whistleblower protection through Kenneth's obsessive documentation. Interactive displays explained money laundering schemes and shell company structures, teaching children how to recognize corruption before they were old enough to participate in it. The plaque beside the vault entrance carried words Melissa had chosen carefully: Kenneth Whitmore, 1933 to 2024, who chose truth over comfort, justice over peace, and the future over his own present. His courage echoes still. The Kenneth Whitmore Foundation for Corporate Accountability grew from Melissa's determination to make Kenneth's sacrifice mean something beyond their personal survival. $2 million annual budget, 7 full-time staff operating from the restored carriage house, providing legal support and financial assistance to whistleblowers nationwide. 23 cases supported in the first year alone workers and accountants and engineers who'd seen crimes and reported them despite knowing the personal cost. Nicole helped after school filing documents and answering phones and learning that justice required paperwork as much as courage. She'd decided she wanted to be an investigative journalist following truth wherever it led, with the fearlessness of someone who'd already survived the worst that powerful people could threaten. Melissa's life transformed in ways that went beyond financial security. From desperate single mother to advocate and philanthropist, from afraid to empowered, from teaching children about historical revolutions to actively participating in one that mattered. She still practiced frugality from habit, still said no to $300 sneakers, still taught Nicole that wealth meant responsibility rather than license for excess. Jonathan Wright became a regular presence at the manor, helping catalog Kenneth's historical documents and assisting with archive educational programs. The friendship developing between them carried potential. Neither rushed to define, both understanding that healing required time and that some connections built slowly were stronger than passion that burned fast. Nicole approved with the casualness of someone who'd survived an attempted murder and gained perspective. "He's really nice, Mom, and he understands why Uncle Kenneth mattered." A year after the trial ended, Melissa sat on the restored porch swing, watching Nicole run through gardens with friends from her new school girls who valued intelligence and kindness over social hierarchies that would have destroyed her in Chicago. Shirley tended rose bushes nearby, humming songs from decades past, white hair catching sunlight like benediction. The manor gleamed with fresh paint and new slate crystal windows, reflecting clouds that raced across Hudson Valley sky. Everything about it suggested permanence, home, in the deepest sense, the physical manifestation of refusing to surrender even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. Kenneth's portrait hung in the restored foyer, commissioned from a photograph taken before paranoia and investigation had worn him down. Young Kenneth, with kind eyes and slight smile, building partnerships that would eventually betray him, still believing the best of people who would prove his trust catastrophically misplaced. Melissa stood before it most mornings, conducting silent conversations with a man she'd never met, but understood completely. "Thank you for everything, for protecting us, for trusting me. I hope you're proud." Nicole burst through the front door, trailing friends and laughter. "Mom, can we show them the vault?" The request came monthly now, Nicole wanting to share the space that had saved their lives with people who couldn't possibly understand what it meant to be hunted underground. Melissa's answer stayed consistent. "When they're older, maybe. It's intense down there." But the real reason was simpler. That vault belonged to them, to the family that had earned its secrets through survival. Nicole understood this without requiring explanation, accepting denial with grace that suggested maturity beyond 12 years. 1 week prior, Melissa had finally opened the 5th Mosler safe, the combination discovered in Kenneth's final letter to Shirley. Inside were personal documents, correspondence with his sister throughout decades of separation, photographs documenting a life before everything went wrong. And at the bottom, sealed in waterproof plastic, a final letter addressed simply to the last Whitmore. The words carved themselves into Melissa's memory. "I don't know if you'll be man or woman, young or old, brave or cautious, but if you're reading this, you've proven worthy. You didn't take Christopher's easy money. You didn't run when threatened. You fought. The Whitmore name was always about integrity, building things that last, standing for something beyond profit. You've restored it. I can finally rest, protect Nicole, protect the truth, live fully, with love and pride, Kenneth." Nicole had cried reading it, understanding that Kenneth had somehow known she'd exist, that his sacrifice would save someone worth saving. Her voice carried wonder, mixed with grief for the man she'd never meet. "He knew we'd win." Melissa had pulled her daughter close, both of them mourning and celebrating simultaneously. He had faith in family, in doing what's right, in the idea that eventually truth wins, even when it takes 30 years. The epilogue of their lives wrote itself in achievements that would have seemed impossible from that Chicago apartment where debt collectors called and air conditioning stayed broken. Melissa, running a foundation that supported 89 whistleblowers across 2 years, featured in Time magazine as a hero of corporate accountability. Nicole, excelling academically and already writing investigative pieces for her school newspaper, asking hard questions adults preferred to avoid. Christopher Kane, serving year 3 of 35 in Attica Correctional Facility, appeals exhausted, facing civil lawsuits that would strip his family of everything accumulated through generations of corruption. Whitmore Manor, designated National Historic Landmark, half-museum documenting one man's fight against systemic fraud, half-family home filled with life Kenneth had died protecting. 27 students funded through the Kenneth Whitmore Whistleblower Descendants Scholarship, $50,000 annually for 4 years, ensuring that speaking truth wouldn't doom children to poverty. Nicole reviewing applications each semester, understanding that her privilege carried obligation. People who tell the truth shouldn't suffer for being honest. The final moment came on a Tuesday evening with no particular significance beyond being theirs. Melissa and Nicole stood together on manor steps, watching sunset turn windows into fire, golden light transforming ordinary glass into something transcendent. Nicole's question carried the hopefulness of someone who'd survived nightmares and earned the right to dream. "Do you think we'll have more adventures?" Melissa laughed, despite herself, despite everything, despite the absurdity of calling attempted murder an underground escape an adventure. "I hope we have a nice, boring, safe life from now on." Nicole grinned with wisdom beyond a 12. "That sounds absolutely perfect." They walked inside together, door closing gently behind them, sealing warmth and light and laughter into a house that had been waiting a century for family worthy of its walls. The manor stood watch over Hudson Valley, darkness, no longer haunted by paranoia and fear, but filled instead with the particular peace that came from justice, finally, belatedly, completely served. Sometimes the greatest inheritances weren't money or property, but courage and integrity and the unshakable will to fight for what's right, even when the entire world insisted you'd lost your mind. Kenneth had left them wealth, yes, but more importantly, he'd left them the example of how one person standing against corruption could eventually triumph if they refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed like the only sane option. Outside unseen, except by those who understood what to look for, roses bloomed in gardens Kenneth had planted decades before, red as the yarn connecting his conspiracy wall, persistent as truth that powerful people couldn't bury no matter how hard they tried.